The weight of a name. The courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, was heavy with an unspoken tension. The wooden benches creaked as the audience shifted, whispering among themselves. The air was thick with expectation, with uncertainty, with the kind of tension that lingers before something irreversible happens. At the center of it all sat Jamir Matthews, a 14-year-old boy, small for his age, but carrying a weight far too heavy for any child. His hands were clenched together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His deep brown eyes flickered between the jury, the judge, and the man sitting at the defense table. The man on trial. Former Officer Brian Keating. Keating sat too comfortably for a man accused of murder. His posture was relaxed, his face unreadable, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't even look nervous. That fact alone sent a cold, sharp dread through Jamir's chest. His father, Darnell Matthews, was a man who had spent his life fighting for others. People who had no voice, no one to speak for them. And now, Jamir was the only voice his father had left. He exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay strong. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said, standing before him. His voice was smooth, professional, but there was an edge of warmth, as if he was trying to make this easier. Jamir adjusted the microphone. His voice came out softer than he wanted. "Jamir Matthews." "And how old are you, Jamir?" 14, he replied. The prosecutor nodded. His expression was carefully controlled, the kind adults put on when they were trying to be gentle. But Jamir could see through it. This wasn't kindness. This was strategy. "You understand why you're here today, correct?" Jamir's throat tightened. He didn't need to be reminded. "I'm here because my dad was killed." The room fell eerily silent. The defense attorney didn't even look up from his notes. Keating didn't move. The prosecutor took a step closer. "Tell us what you remember from that night, Jamir." Jamir closed his eyes for a second. The memory was always there, waiting for him, haunting him. "It was late," he began, his voice steady. "Almost midnight. My dad had just left a meeting. He was working on something. A case about a kid who got arrested for something he didn't do. His fingers curled into his jeans. He had to keep going. We stopped at a gas station. My dad was at the pump, and I went inside to grab a soda." The words got stuck in his throat. The gunshot. It had been so loud, even from inside the store. "I heard the shot," Jamir said, forcing himself to speak. "And I ran outside. My dad was." His breath hitched. He was on the ground. There was blood, and the man standing over him had a gun. The prosecutor nodded, allowing him a moment. "Do you see that man in the courtroom today?" Jamir's eyes snapped toward the defense table. Keating met his gaze. Nothing. No flicker of remorse. No regret. "Yeah," Jamir said, his voice stronger this time. "It's him." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge, Judge Evelyn Carter, lifted a hand, silencing the whispers. "Officer Keating claims your father threatened him," the prosecutor continued. "That he feared for his life. Did you see anything that would suggest your father was violent?" Jamir's jaw clenched. "No, my dad wasn't like that." The prosecutor nodded. "Then tell us, did he have a weapon?" Jamir's heart pounded so loudly, he swore the jury could hear it. "Say it." "No," he said. "He didn't have anything." The prosecutor turned to the jury, letting those words sink in. But then, the defense attorney shifted. "Objection, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "The witness was inside the store at the time of the shooting. He can't possibly say for certain what happened before he ran out." Judge Carter barely blinked. "Sustained," she said. Rephrased the question. Something about her felt off. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't even looking at the prosecutor. She was looking at her notes, like she already knew how this trial was going to end. Jamir gritted his teeth. He wasn't done. The prosecutor turned back to him. "Jamir, when you ran outside after hearing the gunshot, did you see your father do anything aggressive?" Jamir shook his head. No. Did you hear him say anything? The courtroom was silent. Jamir swallowed. Yeah, he said, please. Silence. The prosecutor leaned forward. Just please. Jamir nodded. That's all I heard. Just please. His mother let out a shaky breath from the front row. The defense attorney sighed, standing up. His suit was crisp, expensive. I know this is difficult, he said, his voice smooth. But you were inside the store when the incident happened. Is it possible that your father reached for something? Maybe Officer Keating thought he saw a weapon. Jamir's chest tightened. This was what they did. Even after death, they would try to turn his father into a threat. He shook his head. No. You're absolutely sure? Yes. The defense attorney glanced toward the jury, planting the seed of doubt. Then, with a small sigh, he sat back down. Jamir could feel it happening. The shift in the room, the hesitation, the doubt creeping into people's faces, like the truth wasn't enough. Judge Carter watched without reaction, and for the first time, Jamir really looked at her. Her black robe sat stiff against her shoulders. She wasn't old, maybe in her mid-50s, but something about her felt worn, like someone who had seen too much, done too much, and made peace with it. Except now, as she studied him, something flickered behind her expression. A memory. A hesitation. It was gone too fast to tell. Jamir, the prosecutor said, do you remember what happened after the police arrived? Jamir's jaw tensed. Yeah, they put me in a squad car. The defense attorney cut in. For your protection, correct? Jamir turned toward him. No. They never told me that. A hush spread across the room. The prosecutor seized the moment. So just to clarify, he said, your father was unarmed, shot by an off-duty officer, and instead of comforting you, the police locked you in a squad car. Jamir nodded. Yeah. The prosecutor turned to the jury. But Jamir wasn't looking at them anymore. He was watching the judge. And that's when it happened. A flicker. So quick, so faint, but he saw it. The way her fingers clenched. The way her jaw shifted, just slightly. Like she knew something. Like she wasn't saying something. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was bigger. Jamir's pulse pounded in his ears. His eyes flickered between Judge Carter and Officer Keating. There was something here. Something beneath the surface. Judge Carter's gaze had shifted, not by much, but enough. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him. Like she already knew the ending of this trial. Jamir's breath caught. His father always told him, if you see something wrong, you speak on it. You don't let fear win. And so, he spoke. You're the killer. The courtroom froze. The moment that changed everything. The moment the words left Jamir's mouth, the entire courtroom froze. The sound of shuffling papers, the hushed whispers, the distant hum of the overhead lights, all of it disappeared. All that remained was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. The prosecutor's mouth hung open. The defense attorney's pen slipped from his fingers, rolling across the desk. A few jurors stiffened in their seats, their hands gripping the armrests like they were bracing for something. Something big. Officer Keating, the man who had sat there so relaxed, so certain of his safety, suddenly tensed. His jaw clenched, and his previously steady hands curled into tight fists. He didn't speak, didn't move. But Judge Carter was the real tell. Her fingers twitched against the gavel. Her lips pressed together into a thin, pale line. Jamir saw it, the flicker of recognition, of guilt, of fear. The courtroom might have been frozen, but inside his chest, Jamir's heart was pounding. You're the killer. The words had ripped through the air like a blade. Judge Carter's reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Jamir was watching. And for the first time, he saw her mask crack. She didn't immediately dismiss him, didn't scold him, didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned forward slowly, her voice dangerously calm. "Excuse me." Jameer didn't back down. He didn't blink. He didn't stutter. "You knew," he said, his voice quieter this time, but no less certain. The courtroom inhaled as one, like a living, breathing entity waiting for what would happen next. Judge Carter's fingers tightened around the gavel. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous accusation from a child." But the damage was done. The words were out there, hanging in the air like an inescapable storm cloud. And for the first time, Jameer wasn't the one who looked nervous. The judge was. The weight of her silence was deafening. For the first time, people in the room started questioning. Something was wrong. The jurors glanced at each other. The bailiff near the door shifted uneasily. Even the spectators in the back, many of them reporters, were already reaching for their phones, whispering among themselves. The judge was supposed to control the courtroom. But right now, she was losing it. And she knew it. Her next words would determine everything. Would she deny it? Would she try to shut this down? Would she run? For the first time since this trial had started, Jameer felt like he was in control. But then, the judge did something no one expected. She stood up. She grabbed her gavel, slammed it down once, and said, "This court is adjourned." Then she turned and walked out. Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor stared in disbelief. The defense attorney looked shaken. The jurors were frozen, unsure of what to do. And Officer Keating, for the first time, his mask cracked too. His head snapped toward Judge Carter as she left, like he was watching his safety walk out the door. Jameer didn't move. He barely even breathed. He had expected denial, maybe even anger. But this, she ran. And that was all the confirmation he needed. A judge doesn't walk out of a courtroom in the middle of a trial, not unless she has something to hide. Something big. The silence was obliterated in an instant. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters scrambled to their feet, dialing numbers. The prosecutor turned toward his team, murmuring something in hushed urgency. The defense attorney looked pale, as if he suddenly realized that this case had just become much bigger than a simple trial. Keating. His fists were clenched. He was scared now, and that told Jameer everything he needed to know. He wasn't just fighting one bad cop. He was fighting a system designed to protect him. His mother stood behind him, gripping his shoulder tightly. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. But Jameer could feel the way her hands trembled against him. Not out of fear. Out of something else. Something stronger. Something that felt like hope. And then, a single voice cut through the noise. It came from the jury box. A juror, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, murmured something just loud enough to be heard. She ran. That changed everything. The prosecutor straightened. His expression hardened, shifting from shock to determination. He turned toward the empty judge's seat, then at Keating, then back at Jameer. And then he spoke. "Your Honor is no longer present. I motion to proceed without Judge Carter." Gasps. The defense attorney spun toward him. "You can't be serious." "We request an emergency replacement judge," the prosecutor continued, ignoring the protest. "And we continue deliberations immediately." For a moment, everything was still again. Then the bailiff spoke, his voice sharp and professional. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. It was decided. Judge Carter was gone. And the trial, it was going forward without her." Jameer exhaled, his body shaking. But for the first time, it wasn't from fear. For the first time, he felt like the truth had a chance. And he wasn't going to stop until it was fully uncovered. Cracks in the system. The courtroom was left in shambles after Judge Carter's abrupt departure. Reporters scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Lawyers whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. Even the bailiff, who had been standing like a statue near the exit, had his hand hovering uncertainly over his radio, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Jamir sat there, stunned but not surprised. Because the truth was finally showing itself. The trial wasn't just about Officer Keating murdering his father anymore. It wasn't just about one cop abusing his power. It was about who was protecting him. And the judge. She ran because she was part of it. Jamir, his mother's voice broke through the chaos. She was gripping his shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear. No, it was something else now. Something that looked a little too much like hope. "We need to leave for now," she whispered. "Before anything else happens." Jamir barely heard her. His eyes were locked on Keating. The former cop had been silent for a long time, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like he was bracing himself against an invisible force. For the first time since the trial began, Keating actually looked nervous. Judge Carter was his shield. And now, she was gone. The prosecutor, Mr. Hayes, finally found his voice. "We have 30 minutes, he announced, pulling the entire room's attention toward him. "The court will reconvene. In the meantime, I will be filing for an emergency judicial replacement." The defense attorney, Mr. Calloway, was already sweating. "Your Honor." He paused, realizing too late that the judge wasn't there anymore. "I mean, this is ridiculous. The case should be thrown out." "Why?" Hayes challenged, his voice sharp. "Because your judge ran." A few reporters gasped, immediately scribbling notes. Calloway's face paled. "This is completely unprecedented." Hayes smirked. So is a judge abandoning their own courtroom. The argument could have gone on for hours, but Jamir wasn't interested in their bickering. He was focused on Keating. The way he wasn't looking at anyone. The way he kept his shoulders stiff, his breath coming out just a little too controlled. He wasn't untouchable anymore. And he knew it. Jamir stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. "Come on," his mother urged again, gently guiding him toward the exit. "We need to get some air." He didn't fight her, but as they left the courtroom, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick and humid, pressing against Jamir's skin like a weight. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, activists, and bystanders, all buzzing with the latest shock of the trial. The judge running away was already spreading like wildfire. Cameras flashed as Jamir and his mother stepped outside. A sea of voices exploded around them. "Jamir, did you know about Judge Carter's involvement before today?" "Mrs. Matthews, what will you do if this trial is thrown out?" "Jamir, do you have anything to say about Officer Keating?" He ignored them all. His mother pulled him close, whispering, "Don't answer. Let them talk." A few feet away, Mr. Hayes appeared, cutting through the crowd like a blade. His expression was unreadable. "We need to talk," he said as soon as he reached them. Jamir's mother nodded. "Not here." They moved toward a quieter corner of the courthouse steps. Hayes wasted no time. "We have a problem," he said. Jamir's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" his mother asked, her voice tight. Hayes hesitated. "Keating's lawyer is trying to push for a mistrial." Of course he was. The moment the judge walked out, everything changed. If the case was thrown out, Keating would walk free. Jamir's hands clenched into fists. "And the worst part," Hayes continued, "we don't know where Carter went." Jamir's breath hitched. "She disappeared." Hayes sighed, running a hand down his face. "She left her chambers, didn't speak to anyone. And now she's off the grid. No phone calls, no security footage showing where she went. Just gone." Jamir's chest tightened. She was hiding something. Something big. "What happens if they don't find her?" his mother asked. "Then we might have to start all over," Hayes admitted. "New judge, new jury. Everything." Jamir's blood ran cold. Start over? No. No way. He had worked too hard. Fought too hard. They were so close to exposing the truth. They couldn't let it be buried again. Hayes sighed. "Look, I'm going to do everything I can to keep this trial going. But you should be prepared. He looked directly at Jamir. If they rule this as a mistrial, Keating will be a free man while we wait for a retrial. Jamir's breath quickened. Keating. Free. Like nothing ever happened. No. No. That couldn't happen. His father's voice echoed in his head. If you see something wrong, you speak on it. You don't let fear win. Jamir gritted his teeth. I won't let that happen, he said. His mother squeezed his arm gently, as if trying to reassure him. But he meant it. One way or another, he was going to finish this. 30 minutes later, back in court, the courtroom was even more packed than before. People had heard. The judge had run. The entire city was buzzing. This wasn't just a murder trial anymore. This was a conspiracy unraveling in real time. The tension in the room was suffocating. A new judge, Judge Leonard Parker, had been assigned temporarily to oversee the rest of the case. He was an older man, stern-faced, his graying hair neatly combed back. I have reviewed the details of this case, Judge Parker announced. His voice was deep and commanding, making it clear he wasn't here to play games. The sudden departure of Judge Carter is highly irregular, and an investigation is already underway regarding her conduct. However, he glanced at Keating, then at the jury. This trial will continue. The courtroom exhaled. Keating's shoulders tensed. Jamir could feel it. The pressure was closing in on him. Judge Parker turned to Hayes. Prosecution, you may continue. Hayes nodded. He adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and turned toward Jamir. We left off with your testimony, Hayes said, and I think it's time we continue with it. Jamir sat up straighter. Keating's lawyer started to speak, but Parker shut him down immediately. Enough, Mr. Calloway, the judge said coldly. This boy has already been through enough. Let him speak. And just like that, the courtroom belonged to Jamir again. He turned toward Keating. The former cop wasn't looking so relaxed anymore. His mask was slipping, and Jamir was ready. He inhaled deeply. He was going to finish what his father started. He was going to expose the truth. And this time, no one was going to silence him. The breaking point. The courtroom had changed. It was no longer just a place where justice was being debated. It had become a battlefield. The judge had run. The former officer on trial, Brian Keating, was visibly shaken. And Jamir Matthews, a 14-year-old boy who had never stepped foot in a courtroom before this, was the one turning the tide. He could feel it. The weight of his father's voice in his memory. The whispers among the jury. The shifting unease in the crowd. He wasn't alone anymore. And he wasn't going to stop now. The truth doesn't change. Judge Leonard Parker sat high above the courtroom, flipping through the case files. Unlike Judge Carter, his expression was unreadable. But one thing was clear. He was watching. Listening. Deciding. The prosecution may proceed, Judge Parker said finally, his voice heavy with authority. Hayes nodded sharply before turning toward Jamir. Jamir, he said, his tone steady. Before the previous judge left, we were discussing the events of the night your father was killed. I want to continue there. Jamir's chest tightened, but he nodded. He could do this. You said you heard your father say one word before he died. Yeah. Jamir's voice was firmer this time. He said, please. Just that. Just that. Hayes turned toward the jury, letting the silence stretch. Then he turned back. Did your father have a weapon? No. Did he threaten Officer Keating in any way? No. Did he show any aggression? No. Hayes let out a slow breath. Then tell me, Jamir, in your own words, why do you think your father was shot? Jamir swallowed. The entire courtroom was silent, waiting. He turned his head slowly, toward Keating. The former officer's eyes were locked on the table, avoiding his gaze. And in that moment, Jamir knew the truth. Keating didn't expect this to go to trial. Didn't expect it to go this far. Didn't expect to be in this much trouble. Keating thought he would walk free, just like all the others before him. But now the world was watching. And Jameer wasn't afraid anymore. "My dad was investigating something," Jameer said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "Something important. He was looking into cases where kids were getting arrested for things they didn't do." Hayes nodded. "Go on." "And he had evidence. Proof. Names. Places. A list of officers involved in making sure those kids got locked up." Hayes froze. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Even the jury looked up, startled. This wasn't just about a shooting anymore. This was about corruption. The kind people buried deep. The kind they killed to protect. "My dad was killed," Jameer continued, his hands clenching at his sides, "because he was getting too close. He was going to blow the whole thing wide open. And Keating." He turned to glare at the man. "He was the one who pulled the trigger." Keating jerked up at that. His lawyer immediately shot to his feet. "Objection. This is pure speculation." But Judge Parker held up a hand. "Overruled," he said. "Let the boy speak." The entire courtroom held its breath. The web of lies. Jameer wasn't done. "You want proof," he said, his voice growing stronger. "My dad left behind files. Notes. He told me something big was coming. He didn't know it would be him." Hayes turned sharply. "Wait, you're saying there's evidence of what your father was working on?" "Yeah." Hayes exchanged a look with his assistant, who was already pulling out a sealed manila folder. "My office received an anonymous package 2 nights ago," Hayes admitted, his voice careful. "It contained files, notes, but we weren't sure if it was connected to this case." He turned to Jameer. "Are you telling me those files were from your father?" Jameer nodded firmly. Hayes looked like he had just found a missing puzzle piece. "If those files connect Keating to something bigger," Hayes said slowly, "then we're not just dealing with a murder trial. We're dealing with a criminal conspiracy." The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Keating's lawyer was visibly sweating now. "Your Honor," he tried, "I move for immediate dismissal of these claims." But Judge Parker slammed his gavel down. "Denied," he said. His tone wasn't gentle. Jameer's heart was pounding in his chest. This was it. This was what his father had died for. The truth was finally coming out. Keating's last defense. Keating was pale now. His usual arrogance was gone. Instead of the smug, overconfident man who had walked into this trial like it was just another day, he looked like a man cornered. Like a man realizing his protection was gone. Hayes stepped closer. "Officer Keating," he said, his voice ice-cold. "Do you have anything to say?" Keating didn't answer. He was still. Too still. His fingers were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. And then he did something that made the entire room go silent. He turned, not to the judge, not to the jury, to the empty judge's seat where Carter had been sitting. His jaw clenched. His hands twitched. And for the first time, Jameer saw it. The fear. The realization. Keating had lost. The beginning of the end. Judge Parker cleared his throat. "We will take a recess to examine this new evidence," he announced. But the weight of his words was final. Jameer could feel it. Keating could feel it. This wasn't just another case anymore. This wasn't just another trial designed to protect men like him. This was the beginning of the end. The cracks were spreading. And Jameer, he was going to make sure they shattered completely. The courtroom was no longer just a trial. It was a battlefield. Keating sat frozen, his usual arrogance shattered. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Jameer could see it. This wasn't just about one man pulling a trigger. This was about how many hands were guiding him, how many protecting him, and most importantly, how many would fall with him. The new judge, Leonard Parker, adjusted his glasses and straightened in his chair. His gaze lingered on the documents now sitting in front of him. the evidence Jameer's father left behind. The manila folder held the truth. Names, dates, arrest records, connections between Keating and others just like him. The judge cleared his throat, flipping a page. The tension thickened. The defense attorney, Calloway, was trying to remain composed, but his tight grip on the desk betrayed him. "Your Honor," Calloway said, forcing confidence into his voice, "this evidence is circumstantial at best." The defense. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway." Judge Parker's voice was ice-cold. Calloway stiffened. The jury exchanged glances. This was different. Judge Carter had protected Keating. Judge Parker, he wasn't going to. The power dynamic had shifted. Keating was alone now. No judge to dismiss the truth. No system to shield him. And everyone in the room could see it. The confession no one expected. Hayes stepped forward, gripping the folder. "Your Honor," he said, "I request that we enter these files as official evidence in this trial." Calloway shot up again. "Objection." "On what grounds?" Parker asked, arching an eyebrow. Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no real argument. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Parker sighed, nodding toward Hayes. "Proceed." Hayes turned toward the jury. "In these documents," he began, "we have records of illegal arrests, falsified reports, and fabricated evidence, all linked to former Officer Brian Keating." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Keating flinched. "We also have a list of officers who assisted him." Gasps. Keating turned sharply toward Calloway, his eyes burning with something close to panic. But Calloway wasn't looking at him. The lawyer was sweating now. He was realizing something Keating already knew. Keating was about to become disposable. The system wouldn't protect him anymore. Because once a man like Keating stops being useful, he becomes the next sacrifice. Keating's fingers twitched against the table. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, he exhaled slowly, and he laughed. A hollow, bitter laugh that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "You think this ends with me?" Keating muttered, shaking his head. "You really think this is just about one case?" Hayes stiffened. The jury leaned forward. Even Judge Parker looked intrigued. "Care to elaborate, Mr. Keating?" the judge asked. Keating's jaw tightened. A long silence stretched between them. Then he broke. "You want to know the truth," Keating said, his voice low, sharp. "You want to know why your dad died, kid." The air turned electric. Every breath in the room was held. Keating slowly looked at Jameer, and for the first time, there was no arrogance. No smirk. Just resignation. Because he was right. The courtroom exploded. Gasps. Yells. The sound of reporters scrambling for their phones. Keating had just admitted it. Judge Parker slammed his gavel. "Order." The room settled, but barely. Keating let out another bitter laugh, shaking his head. "They'll let me rot for this," he muttered. "I already know that. But don't think for a second I was the only one involved." He turned to Hayes. "You think you're winning this case? You're not. You're just opening a door." His words sent a chill through the room. Judge Parker leaned forward. "Who is they?" Keating hesitated, and in that moment, Jameer saw it. The genuine fear. The way Keating's fingers twitched against the table. This wasn't just about a cop who killed an innocent man. This was about the ones who made sure he could. The silence dragged. Keating opened his mouth. And then, a loud crash echoed outside the courtroom. The disruption no one saw coming. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. A bailiff rushed inside, his face pale. "Your Honor," he called, his voice tight. "We have a problem." Judge Parker narrowed his eyes. "What kind of problem?" The bailiff hesitated. Then, his next words sent ice down Jameer's spine. Judge Carter was just found in her home. Silence. The entire room was still. Hayes froze. Calloway looked like he was about to be sick. Jameer's heart slammed against his ribs. "Do what?" Hayes asked, his voice tight. "What do you mean found?" The bailiff swallowed. "She's dead." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps. Whispers. Reporters pushed forward, desperately shouting questions. Jameer felt his mother's hand clutch his arm. Keating, for the first time since the trial began, looked genuinely terrified. Hayes stood there, his face blank. Judge Parker had gone pale. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. "There's more," he added. Judge Parker tensed. "Explain." The bailiff licked his lips, his voice quieter now. "They found a note." The room inhaled sharply. Parker straightened. "What did it say?" The bailiff hesitated. Then he read it aloud. "I was never in control." A chill swept through the courtroom. Keating's breathing grew uneven. Hayes' fingers tightened into fists. Jameer sat frozen. Judge Parker finally spoke. "This trial will not be postponed," he announced, his voice sharp, unshaken. "If anything, it has just become more important than ever." Keating let out a slow, shaky breath. And then, for the first time since the trial began, he looked truly broken, because he finally understood. Judge Carter was just the first piece to fall. And soon, everything was coming down. The walls crumble. The moment the bailiff announced Judge Carter's death, the courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was chaos. Reporters pushed against the barriers, shouting questions. Spectators whispered in rapid-fire bursts, their voices blending into a frenzied murmur. The jury members exchanged nervous glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. And at the center of it all, Brian Keating sat frozen. His arrogance was gone. His mask was gone. His confidence was gone. All that remained was fear. Jameer saw it. The way Keating's hands clenched and unclenched. The way his jaw tightened like he was trying to hold back words. He knew something. Something bigger than all of them. Judge Parker slammed the gavel down hard. "Order," his voice thundered. "I will have order in this court." Slowly, the noise dimmed, but it never truly faded. Judge Carter was dead. And that meant this case wasn't just about Keating anymore. It was about who he worked for, and who was covering it all up. A system built to protect itself. Hayes turned to the bailiff. "The note," he demanded. "Who has it?" The bailiff cleared his throat. "It's with the police. They're investigating now." Hayes frowned. "And the cause of death? Officially, suicide." The room inhaled sharply. "Officially," Hayes repeated, his voice dangerously low. The bailiff hesitated. There was no forced entry, no struggle. But he looked at Keating. There were signs that someone might have been in the house before she died. Gasps. Keating didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Because he knew. Jameer could see it. Judge Parker exhaled sharply. "We will not be postponing this case," he declared. "In fact, it has now become even more critical that we see it through to the end." Keating finally snapped. "You don't get it," he barked, his voice raw. The entire courtroom went still. Every single head turned toward him. Keating's hands slammed onto the table. "This isn't about me," he snarled. It never was. The silence was thick enough to drown in. Judge Parker folded his hands. "Then explain, Mr. Keating," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Keating let out a bitter laugh. His shoulders sagged like a man who had finally realized the inevitable. "A trial," he muttered, shaking his head. "You think this is about a trial." No one spoke. No one dared to. Keating looked up at the jury, then at the prosecutor, then finally at Jameer. "Your father was a dead man the moment he started asking the wrong questions," Keating said, his voice dark and hollow. "And you just put a target on your back, kid." Jameer's stomach twisted, but he didn't look away. He refused to. "Who killed Judge Carter?" Hayes demanded, stepping forward. Tell us who you're protecting." Keating exhaled sharply. "You think they'd let me name names?" His voice was shaky now. "You think Carter's dead because she ran. She didn't run. She was silenced." More gasps. Hayes' hands clenched. "And you're next," he said flatly. Keating let out another hollow laugh. "Damn right I am." Silence stretched again. Judge Parker steepled his fingers. "And yet," he said, voice controlled, "you haven't run." Keating froze. Jameer saw it. That split-second hesitation. He hadn't run. He could have. But he stayed. Keating licked his lips, his throat bobbing. "Because I know it won't matter. They'll kill me whether I talk or not." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Then, finally, Keating sighed. "If I go down," he muttered, "I might as well take someone with me." The courtroom inhaled. Judge Parker leaned forward. "Are you saying you're willing to testify against your associates?" Keating let out a slow, shaky breath. "I'll name names," he said, "but in exchange, I want protection." More murmurs. Hayes glanced at Judge Parker, then at Jameer's mother, who was holding her breath. Then, finally, he turned back to Keating. "We can make that happen," he said. Keating exhaled. And then, the doors burst open. The disruption no one saw coming. The entire courtroom turned. A man in a suit stormed inside, flanked by two other men in federal uniforms. FBI. Hayes tensed. "What the?" One of the agents flashed his badge. "Judge Parker," he said briskly, "we are here to remove the defendant, Brian Keating, from your custody. He is being transferred to federal jurisdiction immediately." Stunned silence. Keating went rigid. His eyes widened, flickering with something Jameer had never seen before. Panic. "Wait. What?" Hayes barked. "You can't do that. He just agreed to testify." The agent's face was unreadable. "It's out of your hands now." "No, it isn't," Judge Parker snapped, his voice sharp and full of authority. "This case is ongoing." "Orders from above," the agent interrupted. "This is bigger than your courtroom, Judge. Keating is coming with us." Keating shook his head violently. "No," he barked. "No, no, no. You don't get it." He jerked against the table, panic written all over his face. "You don't understand," Keating shouted, his voice cracking. "They're not taking me to a safe house. They're taking me to the grave." The courtroom erupted in disbelief. Hayes spun toward the FBI agent. "This is a cover-up," he accused. "You're burying him before he can talk." The agent's expression didn't change. "You need to stand down." Keating thrashed against the officers now gripping his arms. "Listen to me," he howled. "This isn't over. It never was. Your dad, he knew, kid. He knew what they were doing." Jameer's breath caught in his throat. Keating was dragged backward. "You have the files," Keating shouted, his voice desperate now. "It's all in the files. The cops, the judges, the politicians, they're all in it." The words rattled the courtroom. The jury sat stunned. Judge Parker's face hardened. Hayes looked ready to fight. But it was too late. Keating was hauled through the doors. His last words echoed through the chamber. "They'll come for you next." Then, silence. Keating was gone. The courtroom sat in stunned disbelief. Then, slowly, all eyes turned to Jameer. The only witness left. The only one who could finish what his father started. Jameer swallowed hard. Because Keating was right. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The final move. The courtroom had never felt so empty. Even though it was still packed with spectators, reporters, and legal officials, the absence of Brian Keating left behind a strange, suffocating silence. His last words echoed in Jameer's mind. "They'll come for you next." Jameer sat stiffly in his chair, feeling the weight of every single gaze on him. Keating was gone. Judge Carter was dead. And the real players, still out there. Judge Parker cleared his throat, trying to restore order, but it was pointless. Everyone in the room had the same sinking realization. This case was never about justice. It was about control. And someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings to make sure that control was never lost. Jameer gritted his teeth, because now they were looking at him. Now he was the last one left. The only one who could finish what his father started. And that meant he had a decision to make. The deal that changed everything. The courtroom remained tense as Hayes stood up. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the edges of the evidence folder, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Your Honor," Hayes said, his voice firmer than before. "The prosecution requests an emergency recess." Judge Parker frowned. For what purpose? Hayes exchanged a quick look with Jameer, then with his mother. Then, finally, back to Parker. "To regroup," he said, "to reassess what we have left after Keating's removal." The courtroom stirred. The defense attorney, Calloway, sighed, rubbing his temples. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this trial has already gone beyond its original scope. The witness's main accusation just walked out of here in federal custody. This is exactly why it needs to continue." Hayes cut in, his voice sharp and unyielding. "We've just witnessed the most blatant act of obstruction in a court of law. If we stop now, this entire case disappears." Jameer's chest tightened, because he knew Hayes was right. Judge Parker let out a slow breath, assessing the damage. He glanced toward the empty seat where Judge Carter had once sat, then at the spot where Keating had been just moments ago. He saw it too, the game being played, the way the system was moving against them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Parker nodded. 30-minute recess, he said, his voice heavy. "Court is dismissed, for now." The gavel slammed down. The meeting no one was supposed to hear. Jameer followed Hayes and his mother into a private side room, away from the prying eyes of the press. The second the door closed, Hayes turned to them. "This isn't just a murder trial anymore," he said, running a hand down his face. "This is something bigger." Jameer's mother folded her arms. "We've known that since the moment my husband was killed," she said quietly. Hayes sighed. "I know, but the way things are happening, this means someone high up is watching this case closely. Keating might be alive, but the second he got taken into federal custody." Hayes shook his head. "He's dead. Whether it happens tomorrow or next week, they'll get rid of him." Jameer swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" he asked. Hayes turned toward him, his eyes piercing. "We get ahead of them." Jameer frowned. "How?" Hayes exhaled. "We leak the files." Jameer's stomach dropped. "You mean, give them to the press?" Hayes nodded. "If we let the system handle this, it'll bury everything. But if we make sure these documents get out to the public first, then they can't be erased." Jameer's mother hesitated. "But if we do that, won't we be targets too?" "Yes," Hayes admitted, "but you already are. The moment Keating pointed to something bigger, you became a problem. They don't care whether you're guilty or innocent. They care that you're talking." Jameer let the words sink in. He wasn't naive. He had seen what had happened to his father, to Judge Carter, to Keating. And yet, despite everything, he wasn't afraid. Because if they stopped now, then his father's death would be for nothing. "Do it," Jameer said. His mother's head snapped toward him. "Jameer." "No." Jameer cut in, his voice steady. "This is the only way. If we don't tell the world, then no one will ever know what they did." His mother studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. And just like that, everything changed. The day the world found out. The files went out that night. Within hours, major news networks were flooded with breaking reports. Corrupt cops, falsified arrests, judges covering up crimes. And at the center of it all, Brian Keating. Within 24 hours, the case exploded into something even bigger than the trial. More victims came forward. More whistleblowers stepped up. By the end of the week, the Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation. But it didn't stop there. Because then the first arrest happened. Not just any arrest, a high-ranking police official. Then another. Then another. Jameer watched it unfold from his living room, his heart pounding in disbelief. For the first time, the system was actually breaking. For the first time, his father's work was winning. He turned to his mother, who sat beside him, her hands covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. Because after everything, after the trial, the threats, the loss, the betrayals, it was finally happening. The truth was out. The aftermath. Months passed. Keating never reappeared. Judge Carter's case was quietly closed, ruled an unfortunate suicide. But Jameer knew better. He knew the fight wasn't over. That corruption didn't just die overnight. But at least now, the world saw it, and that was more than his father ever had. Jameer stood in front of his father's grave, the wind whispering through the trees. He reached into his pocket, pulling out one of the last notes his father ever wrote. It was simple, short, but it was the words that had carried him through all of it. If you see something wrong, you speak on it. You don't let fear win. Jameer smiled sadly. I did it, Dad, he whispered. I spoke. And for the first time since the trial began, Jameer finally felt free. The storm had finally passed. But the war wasn't over. Jameer stood at his father's grave, the weight of everything he had endured settling in his chest like an anchor. The trial had been a battlefield. The corruption had been exposed. Keating was gone. Judge Carter was dead. The files had ignited a fire across the country. Yet, deep down, Jameer knew this wasn't the end. Because corruption didn't just fall overnight. It fought back. And somewhere, in the shadows, there were still people trying to clean up the mess. Trying to silence the ones who spoke. Jameer felt his mother's hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? She asked softly. He exhaled. I don't know, he admitted. But at least people know the truth now. She nodded, squeezing his hand. Your father would be proud of you. He swallowed hard. Yeah, he whispered. I hope so. The wind blew gently, rustling the leaves, as if whispering back. And for the first time in a long time, Jameer felt like he had done something that mattered. But before he could let himself breathe again, his phone buzzed. A warning from the shadows. It was an unknown number. Jameer hesitated, glancing at his mother before slowly pressing answer. Hello, he said cautiously. Silence. Then, you should have stopped when you had the chance. Jameer's breath hitched. The voice was deep, calm, controlled. Not Keating. Not a cop. Not anyone he recognized. This was someone else. Someone higher up. A chill ran down his spine. Who is this? He demanded, gripping the phone tightly. Doesn't matter. The voice was eerily smooth. What matters is that you and your mother are still alive. If you want to keep it that way, forget what you started. Jameer's fingers curled into a fist. Or what? He asked, his voice sharp. Or you end up like your father. The line went dead. Jameer slowly lowered the phone, his pulse thundering in his ears. His mother watched him carefully. What is it? She asked. He exhaled, shaking his head. Nothing, he lied. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. Not even close. One last move. That night, Jameer sat at his desk, staring at his father's old files. He thought about Keating, about Judge Carter, about the faceless voices trying to erase the truth. They wanted him to be afraid, wanted him to back down. But his father's voice echoed in his mind. If you see something wrong, you speak on it. You don't let fear win. Jameer inhaled sharply. Then he pulled out his phone and started recording. "My name is Jameer Matthews," he said, staring into the camera. "And if you're seeing this, it means someone tried to silence me." He leaned closer. "But I won't be silenced." His father had started this fight. Now it was his turn to finish it, even if it meant becoming the next target, even if it meant risking everything. Because the truth deserved to be heard. And this time, no one could stop it. Epilogue. A legacy that couldn't be erased. A year later, the world had changed. The trial had sparked nationwide protests. More corrupt officials had been removed, investigated, or jailed. Keating was never seen again. Judge Carter's death remained a mystery. But Jameer, he never stopped. He spoke. He fought. And in doing so, he became more than just a witness. He became a symbol. A reminder that no matter how many times the system tried to erase the truth, there would always be someone willing to fight for it. Just like his father. And just like him.